Let's look at how to create a combination graph. So that just means a graph that uses two different graph styles in Illustrator to plot numeric data. So it's really a comparison. So you have to make sure that your content is appropriate or it will work with this method. So what I'm going to do is choose to change my average high to a line graph. Now a couple of things. If I click just once, I get my March high. This isn't going to work. If I click a second time, I get March, April, May, everything in my graph. But if I go to Object and Graph and to Type, and if I choose, say, Line, and click OK, it's not going to work. What I have to do is make sure I click on my entire group, which means including that legend of the average high, because it needs to have every piece or every component of this group, of this piece of it. So then with everything there selected, click 3 times. I'm going to go to Object and I'm going to go to Graph and I'm going to go to Type. And so here I'm going to choose Line. And some of these, like I said, some of these options up here, this just doesn't work. So it's good to experiment. It's good to, again, pay attention to what you see out there used in infographics, and try to, really experiment. That's really the key. Now, the one thing I do want to make sure is that I do not have my drop shadow at this point. That will just make a muddy graph. It will be confusing. So turn that off. Now, as far as options with my line, I want to make sure I do mark my data point. So that means that each one of those specific numeric values has a dot at that point. So I want to make sure that is checked. I want to make sure that edge to edge lines is checked. And I also want to connect my data points. That means that from here to here, they'll be connected. That's what a line chart is. All right, so if I want to draw filled lines, I can and put a width there. I can also customize that later. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And you can see how this changes the dynamics of this graph a bit. Let me click out in the middle of nowhere to deselect. So you can see what's happening here as far as connections. It's maybe a little more difficult to see, so it would probably need a little bit of editing. So what I want to do is take this, I'm going to right click, let's click the whole thing with my selection, my direct selection tool here. We'll click all of them. And if I right click, I'm able to arrange and bring this to the front if it's not already. Now mine was, yours may not. So bring it to the front. We don't want them to be hiding behind the other bars. And then what I need to do is probably thicken this up a bit. My stroke weight is only at 2. Let's take this to be a little bit, maybe a little bit too much there. No, let's click this again here. Let's go around 10. Okay, notice I have some rounded happening here, and that's probably coming from my stroke, what kind of caps I'm using. I can choose whatever end point I want here. Okay, so that applies. This is a stroke. Now these little markers, my little data points, those are actually little boxes. And if I zoom in here, you're able to see that it actually, a little bit too far. Well, here you go. It actually is a box with a stroke. So if you wanted to, you could get rid of your stroke, but let's put a different fill color on there. We'll just make this easy. And I'll double click on my hand tool to take me back to viewing this all in one window, and you can see how very much that points out, maybe a little bit too dramatic, but you can see how we can customize this now. So again, if I use my selection tool, everything gets selected. If I use my direct selection tool and I click kind of in the middle of nowhere to deselect, I can select this whole compartment here, this whole group, and you can see I can change this if I would desire to do that. So you can customize these. Again, stick with a color scheme that you're using, and depends on the look of it that you're going for. So that's how you can make a combination graph. And probably what I need to do is make that point be a little bit darker, probably a black point maybe. That's the best. Okay, so play around with it. Play with the different ways that we can combine these things. Be careful that you don't make it too confusing that your viewer can't comprehend.